I'm Nina Collins from Hello Revel, and I'm the founder of The Wolfer and now the Chief Creative Officer at Revel, and really, really loving it. Revel, as you all know, is an events and community platform for women over 40. Every Wednesday at 3 o'clock, I interview a different expert, and on the third Wednesday of every month, that expert, for the time being, as long as she's willing to do it, is Dr. Debbie Magids, who is an amazing therapist from New York City. I always should give the disclaimer that she was my therapist quite a while ago for a good chunk of my life, about 10 years in my 30s into my 40s. I'm now 52. I adore Debbie and think she's a genius. She's written a book called Not All the Good Ones Are Taken, about dating, which she published quite a long time ago. You can follow her on Instagram. She does a wellness program with a nutritionist. What's the program called again, Debbie?
360 Up Close.
360 Up Close.
Yeah. And
she does these wonderful videos on Instagram. And today we're going to talk about boundaries, which is one of my favorite subjects. And the way technically this works is we are recording this, both video and audio, because it'll get released on our podcast, Raging Gracefully, which comes out every Friday. And so everyone in the room, in the webinar, we now have 54 people in the room. You can talk in the chat, you can ask questions in the chat, you can also raise your hand. So if you want to talk, as long as you're comfortable being recorded, we're happy to have you talk, using your own voice and interacting with us. Very happy to.
We would love it, actually.
We would love it. Exactly. We'd love people to raise their hands, and you won't be identified on our podcast. It'll just be a voice. So it's not like anyone will know. I mean, I might say your first name if that's okay. Like, question from Cindy, but you really won't be outed because no one would know it's you. Sydney, who's my colleague at Revel, who's fabulous, may chime in when I make a mistake or don't know how to do something. So don't, Sydney, feel free. And let's just go ahead. So welcome, Debbie, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Hi, everybody.
So I guess to start, I will say that I don't think I had any understanding of what boundaries were growing up. I don't think anyone ever talked to me about boundaries. And I think probably going into adulthood in my 20s and 30s, like I would hear it, but not really think about it, or probably I used it wrong, or probably I overused it the way I think a lot of people overuse narcissism. I just really didn't think about it. And then I would say I may have subconsciously been learning better boundaries through therapy, but it was really when one of my children, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, had a real mental health crisis. And my whole family was thrown into it. Was kind of at the end. My own therapy was actually almost over and I was doing much better personally, but my son had a real crisis and we were thrown into, I don't know if any of you have ever been in this situation. Literally, there was like a 4-month period where I was talking to a therapist every day. I was either talking to a parenting coach or his therapist or the family therapist. I mean, it was just like everyone was in therapy. And it was during that crisis that I really feel like I got better at my boundaries. Like I really got better at realizing that it's super important for me to decide what I can do and what I can't do. And that not everything is about me, and to not make the situation about me. And anyway, Debbie's here to give us much more guidance about boundaries, but I personally feel at 52, like I have so much better boundaries now than I ever did. And it's kind of life-changing. Like I feel so much more kind of centered and not codependent, and very clear about what's yours and what's mine, like that kind of thing,
Yeah. So let's talk. So when we're talking boundaries, especially when I talk boundaries, I'm talking about emotional boundaries. And what Nina's talking about, and I can attest to that, she had no boundaries when we first started together. It was a long road to help her get some boundaries and then some. But it's more like thinking in terms of where I end and where someone else begins, right? And for many people on a psychological level, an emotional level, they don't think about it in those terms because, again, as I will always say, everything's coming from childhood, everything's coming from the unconscious. So, I thought a good way to start, just for everyone who's listening, I'm going to say a few things and start to put it together. Am I someone who doesn't have good boundaries, right? So if I say to you, where are you in your ability to say no, right? If you are someone who has trouble saying no, you most likely don't have good boundaries, okay? Are you a people pleaser? If you are, most likely don't have good boundaries. Now, again, it doesn't have to be all of these things. These are just things you want to mull around. Are you someone who feels responsible for other people's happiness? Right? This is a big one. Are you someone who feels depleted because your needs go unmet? And by the end of the day, by the end of the week, you are exhausted because you've put out so much energy on taking care of everybody else. So there are more questions I can ask, but these are four the big ones that will put you in the category that you need to start working on your boundaries. Okay.
So good. Now immediately I can think of one of a family member who I'm already going to send this conversation to, because who's classic no boundaries. Mm-hmm. So if you don't have good boundaries, what do you do?
Yeah. So first of all, I always think understanding why you don't have good boundaries is super important, right? So most people that don't have good boundaries, it could actually happen in one of two ways. You could have come from a childhood that had no boundaries and you just never learned it, and people were crossing them all the time. But again, that's one section, where you literally never learned boundaries. But more often than not, those people become very rigid with their boundaries.
What does that mean?
I lost you.
Interesting.
Okay, there you are.
Yeah, we lost each other for a sec. Yeah, sorry. I'm gonna move. See if that's...
So a lot of people that had no boundaries young actually have, what I've seen, grow up to have very rigid boundaries. It's like they really keep them because otherwise they'll feel out of control. A lot of people, a lot of us, and I am a former person of this, we were the good ones of the family. We were the ones who didn't want to cause any problems. There were too many other things going around. We were probably meeting the needs of our parents or our siblings, or we came from a place where somebody was depressed or a sibling wasn't doing well, and we were the peacemakers of the family. So the majority of people that fit into the categories of not having good boundaries, good emotional boundaries, usually came from a place where it was never about them. It was always about everybody else. And they were filling everyone's happiness and they were taking care of everybody. And so then we go into adulthood not understanding that that's what's happening. Are you there, Neen? I think I lost you again.
I am. No, I'm here. What's the relationship? That makes me think, what's the relationship between boundaries and codependence? Maybe you can define codependence.
Well, okay. So I hate using those names and those titles and those diagnoses, but it falls under the same category. Because I think once you label yourself codependent, everyone just goes, "No, I'm a codependent." I think it's much better to really understand. But yeah, that is when people are starting to meet the needs of other people. And where the codependence comes in, and I was going to bring this up, those of us who are under the guise of the good one and the peacemaker, and we have to fill everyone's needs and we can never say no, we have formed an identity around that. And as much as we can say everyone needs so much from me, we need to be needed. So that's another facet of that. And that's another facet of what people out there, codependence is used like narcissism. Like people have an idea of what it is. So I like to leave it out of the conversation, quite honestly.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And sorry for bringing it up, but I think it's tricky. It's interesting to understand because I'm not a people pleaser and don't think I ever really was particularly. I don't really have trouble saying no, but I really did have a hard time with boundaries, right? So the way I experienced that, I think, is a kind of the way I experience, I suppose, is an inability to, I always do this with my hands because it's like, it's a neediness. It's a kind of need to be in everyone's story and have everyone be in my story, and kind of, there's a controlling aspect to it.
Yes. So you fall into that category of your emotional needs were never met by your parents. So there's an emptiness there. So and also I think you are someone who feels that you can make other people's lives better, or the right way. But that's the part where I'm like, your identity was around needing people to feed your emotional needs. So that's where yours came from. There are different facets to it. And the reason why I gave the 4 top ones is we're not all the same, but one of them or 2 of them are going to make sense for each person out there. And so if you're one of those things, you want to start to explore why, and that's why childhood is so important. Why did you become this way? And for you, Nina, that's why you became that way. You know, it was life or death for you to be the one who took care of everything, because there was no structure for you. There was no one taking care of anything, and you continued that into your life, right? That's your personal story.
Yeah. And so would you say it's fair to say that most people struggle with boundary issues? Or no. So maybe tell us how does someone raise a kid with no boundary issues?
Well, okay. It's not that black and white, you know, so everything's on a continuum, right? So yeah, boundary issues are a thing that everyone's on a continuum, but it's where do you fall on the continuum, right? Are you in the sort of middle ground where you're just trying to figure it out, right? You're in a relationship, what's mine, what's yours, whose needs get met when, right? Or are you on an extreme of something? There are some people who are so rigid that they have no fluidity to their boundaries. There are some people that have no boundaries and they need to rein it in and pull back, and not everyone's issues are your issues. Not everyone's life is your business, right? Not up to you to create everything. Now, the other piece is people that err on trying to make the whole world happy and can't say no, right? That facet of not having boundaries. You have to start to think about, like, why can't you say no? Or why are you a people pleaser? You know, are you afraid of someone's anger? Are you afraid not to be liked? Are you afraid that someone won't love you anymore? Are you afraid to be left out? Like, what is underneath the inability to say no, or the inability to not people please, right? The other thing, because I just want to get the points out so people can think about this and then ask, you know, personal individual questions, is, you know, a lot of us who are not getting our needs met, right? This is the scale, other people's needs, our needs. But really, we're supposed to be at least equal to or meeting our own needs more so than meeting other people's needs. And this is especially from those people who were the good ones, who never got their needs met young or are so depleted. And so the task there would be to try to start meeting our own needs equal to the way we're trying to meet other people's needs, and that are helping us now cross boundaries, right? So it's all interconnected. Depletion.
So wait, I want you to say that part again. Okay. So the task is to meet our own needs
before we start meeting the needs of others. Yeah. And anyone who falls into this trap, it's really off balance, and they're feeling so depleted. And so I don't believe the people that start here are ever going to be here, but at least if you start to think about what you need more so than what other people need, we start to sort of tip the scale to a more even base.
Sometimes I get accused, I mean, actually with men, I mean, and you know this about me too, I get accused a lot with men of saying like it's too much about what I'm very clear about what I need. And I don't think I'm being unfair. I feel like it's okay. Like I have boundaries.
Yeah.
But men don't like it when women, like, it's an interesting thing. I mean, I know that sounds like a stereotypical thing to say, but like I recently had, you know, I'm having this debate about whether and when to move in with my boyfriend. And I'm like, I kind of like the way it is now. I'm not sure I want to move in. And
go ahead.
I have to figure out, I mean, that's like an interesting thing where we are, like, I've been accused of being too boundaried a little bit in this relationship.
Right. But it's not where you started. And it's important for especially your audience to know that this is where you've ended up. That is not where you started, right? Like if we go to the trajectory, and like I do know Nina's whole life, luckily, and the ins and outs. But if you go through the trajectory of where I met you to where you are now, you know, you don't think you were a people pleaser or that you always had the ability to say no, but you were actually the one running everyone's lives. You weren't saying no at all. You were, and when your relationship broke up, you all of a sudden fell apart.
Completely.
You did. So you are in this category, even though you don't think you are, because it was so long ago. Right?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
You evolved and evolved and evolved. And, you know, since you're so open with things, like this is the healthiest relationship you've ever been in, because you evolved and evolved and evolved to a point where you're not crossing boundaries. You're not taking care of everyone's whole lives. You are putting your needs first. And that was not the case, young.
No, you're right. It's really awesome. Like my current boyfriend has 3 kids and I like his kids, but I don't really want to get involved. Like I don't really care. And when there's like drama, like I'm kind of a little like this.
This was not where you started, my love.
No,
right?
remember
But it is where you've ended up, which is the
I
place we want everyone to end up. Yeah.
And who knows where I'm going? It's so exciting. Well, do we have questions from the audience? Because people are saying they completely relate, super relevant. The oxygen mask metaphor, of course, of putting the oxygen mask on first before you can help others.
Yeah.
So I guess and someone says, you mentioned creating rigid boundaries. I know this is a general question without background, but is there such a thing as being too rigid? That's right. That's Joyce. It's a little bit what I was kind of saying.
Yes.
As it relates to having good relationships with family or friends. And I would just want to add to that, when Debbie was talking about that, I have one child who has complete boundary issues. It's really something she has to work on. And then the other is super rigid. Both, I'm sure, in reaction to the way she was raised, they were raised by me, right? They took 2 different paths. Yeah. So yes, you definitely can be too rigid.
And it's very important to understand that when you're one end or the other end, it's the same issue fueling it. You know, you can flip flop in both ways. And that's why I said there's a lot of people who came from no boundaries that get very rigid, but they don't, it depends. It can go both ways. And I'm trying to give everyone a smattering so you can find yourselves, right? Because it's not a black and white thing. But yes, of course, boundaries can be too rigid, especially if you're trying to have relationships with people and there's no fluidity, there's no ability to sort of go with the flow or accept things that don't go your way. People get very upset. But you do have to understand that people that have very rigid boundaries, there's a out of controlness inside that they're trying to contain. So, you know.
So the goal then, I think what you're saying, the goal is really to find balance with boundaries, right? So when what you just said actually just speaks to another question from Kathleen in the audience saying, I'd like you to talk more about being involved with someone who has kids and not wanting to be that involved with them. It feels a little selfish. You're right, Kathleen. I think it certainly can feel a little selfish, I think, to everyone involved. And it's something I struggle with. Like I'm kind of trying to, I do feel, having run this community now for 6 years, you know, the Wolfer community, I feel like I've noticed a lot of women have a really hard time, a lot of people in general, just kind of saying what they want. And I've tried to get really clear about what I want, because I feel like, you know, we're going to die soon. We should have what we want. We should know what we want. But it's true to what Debbie just said. If you're in a relationship, you have to be fluid, right? So if my partner needs me to go to his son's graduation or to care about the college application process, I have to give a little. And it's something that we're navigating, because I like his children, but I have 4 of my own, and I like not having kids at home anymore. So I'm a little over having kids at home. So, and I feel like that's kind of fair. Like I'm allowed to feel that way. So it's a struggle a little bit.
You know, just to add on, to add on, this notion of, if I meet my own needs, I'm being selfish. That's an interesting topic, because a lot of people so let's say you're someone who's coming from this, like, I never say no to people. I've always been the one to take care of everyone. And then all of a sudden you have this revelation, this awareness of like, well, everyone else's lives are going really nicely, but I am depleted and I need to start to make change. There will be a reaction. People will think you're being selfish. But if selfish equals taking care of your own needs, then I guess we all need to be a little selfish, right? And sometimes you need to go from north to south, right? You have to go from I'm too depleted to I'm completely taking care of myself. But the goal is always to get somewhere back in the middle, where I'm putting my needs out, I'm getting them met, I don't feel depleted. And then, yeah, maybe I can say yes sometimes to being with my boyfriend's children and being there for them, but it shouldn't be an expectation that it's all the time, right? So it's again, it's everyone's personal journeys. These are sort of points to take into your personal journey and see where it fits.
Yeah. So 2 listeners have said the same thing, that they'd love some steps to think about how to work on change. And I think one of the things you said is understanding where it comes from, where the lack of boundaries come from.
Yeah, so the first part is always awareness. And the reason why I think it's so important to go back to the root cause, it's not because we can change anything that happened in the past. And I always like to say you got to go backwards to move forwards. You just need a roadmap of like, what happened? Why do I feel what I feel? So I can pinpoint what I need to shift in my own life, right? It's not cookie cutter. Right? The process is the same. So you need to really pinpoint, like, what is it that I'm feeling? where I am triggered and what do I need to shift? Now, I'm going to give you 2 surefire things that I think everyone on the planet should be doing. When you are asked something,
writing them down.
Yes, because these are my 2 favorites. If you are asked to do something, you always, before you respond to anything, ask yourself the question, what's my motivation? Okay. Always. What is my underlying motivation? Am I going to be doing something to please someone because I'm afraid that they'll leave me? I'm afraid of their anger. I'm afraid that I will feel so guilty and I can't tolerate how that feels, because then I will say, live through what that feels like. Am I afraid that my life is transactional, and if I don't say yes, no one will ever love me? Like, you need to understand your motivation to things. If your motivation is, I really want to do this, it will bring me joy, or you know what, John has been so goddamn nice to me, like I can do this for him and I feel good about it, right? Like, then by all means say yes. But if it's any of the other things, I'm looking for you guys to sort of back up and pay attention. So what's my motivation? And the second thing is, if I say yes to something, right, how much will it deplete me? How much is it going to take away from me? And if the answer is too much, then the answer has to be no.
Yeah, I have to say that's the one I really used with this kid scenario. Like, there were times over COVID, because we were navigating 2 households, and there was a time when he wanted to come with his son for like 3 weeks, and I was like, it was a small house, and I was like, that's just going to be too much for me. And I said it as kindly as I could. And I said, I love you. And it's not that I don't want to be with you, but that's just, I know, actually, this reminds me of something I learned that I thought was really great. I interviewed a writer named Mia Birdsong about a year ago, and she wrote in her book, she has a book about community, and she wrote this line that really stuck with me, where she said, resentment is a sign that your boundaries have been crossed. So simple. It was like, if you find yourself in a situation and you're feeling really resentful, it's on you, because you've allowed, you've allowed something to happen. You've said yes when you shouldn't have. And I really used that in this situation with my boyfriend, and this, because I'm no good to anyone if I'm feeling resentful. Like, that's just bad.
Wow. Yes. Yeah. And that's what you've really learned, to pay attention to what you need, what your boundaries are, and act on them where that wasn't true in the past. And it has changed the trajectory of how you feel in the world. It really has.
Yeah, it really, really has. So someone else says, how do we get other people on board with our boundaries if they're used to the person without any, losing them altogether?
Yeah, well, that's,
it's a good question.
That's the growing pains you have to go through if you want to change. Change is really hard. And particularly if you're part of a family unit, there's a homeostasis to all couples, friendships, family units, where there's an expectation of how people are going to be in the world. And people don't like when we change, because then they're forced to sort of look at themselves, or have to change, or have to pick up some slack, or deal with something, right? So there's no magic bullet here other than communication, right? Like letting people know, like, and I have this thing, we could do more on it, but the way we communicate is stroke, responsibility, messaging. It's a surefire way to think.
Say that again.
Stroke, responsibility, the message, meaning, I love you. You're so important to me. I have to take responsibility because I've been acting in a certain way forever, and it's my fault, but here's what's going on for me, right? Yeah. And it's really the best way to communicate. We should really talk more about it, because it usually works.
Well, I have to say, it speaks to two. So someone in the chat asked how it went when I said, no, your son can't come for 3 weeks. Yeah. And I said it went really well, because I think I basically used that technique. Yeah. I was kind, I was clear, I was loving, I was honest. And he ultimately respected that. And also, I'm thinking back to that question that we just did about, how do we get other people on board? I do think that time I referred to with my kids when we were in a real family crisis, I think my behavior changed after that, and it was kind of confusing for the kids. And now I think they're really happy about it. But there were times when I was kind of stepping back a little, and they were confused. They were like,
yes. And that's why Yeah. And that's why you have to tell people like this is happening and you just keep talking about it. Also, we get to these sort of unconscious dance steps with people. And when we change the dance steps, they lose their partner. Like think about it like that.
You know how it came up? Actually, I can give a concrete example. This is kind of awful, but we curse pretty freely in my family, and the kids have grown up using whatever language they want. And there was always kind of it's language, it's fine, tolerance. And then I started to realize that it was really stressing me out having the kids curse at me, like having angry words in my midst. Like I grew up in a very angry household. There was a lot going on all the time. For a long time, I think I just thought that was normal. And then there was a point, probably, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago, where I was like, I don't want anyone yelling at me, and I don't want anyone saying fuck you to me. I just don't. And I can't deal with it anymore. And in fairness, the kids were like, what are you talking about? Like, you've been using curse words your whole life. You've always let us use curse words. Like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Like, they were completely not on board. And it was at that moment where they were like leaving the house, they were 15 to 20 or so. And I started saying like, you can't be in my house if you're going to speak that way to me, or really to anyone. Like, I just don't want to hear it. And I'm not mad at you. I just can't tolerate it. And it was really interesting actually. And they've stopped. Yeah, it's super, super interesting. So that's a really good example of it that I hadn't thought of.
And I'm going to say to everyone, it's a process and you just have to stick with it and be consistent. And, the thing is, if you want someone to change with you, you can't say something, then do a different behavior, and then go back to the behavior. Like, to extinguish old behavior, that you have to have a lot of consistency, and you may have to talk to them over and over again and remind them and withstand feeling bad, or withstand being called selfish, or withstand feeling guilty, till you get to the other side. And again, I wish you had known Nina before, but she's a perfect example of she's at the other side where it's now rote for her. She doesn't have to think about doing anything different. She's just different. But getting there, she had to really think about it. And it was painstaking, steps along the way. And that's the truth.
Yeah, no, it was really brutal. I was in therapy for so long. And for so many years, I felt like, the usual things we all feel in therapy, like, what is the point? Like, you can kind of understand the problem or the root problem, what your fucked up childhood was or whatever, but it doesn't mean you can make the change. I honestly think that the secret, it's endless talking in therapy, but a lot of it, like when you just said, Debbie, you tell the person to sit in it, to sit in the uncomfortable feeling, like if they don't want to say no because they're afraid they'll feel guilty, or I see this with one of my daughters who has a lot of boundary issues. Like, it's just really hard for her to sit with that feeling. And I think that correlates to a lot of stuff in therapy. Like for me, it was a lot of like learning to just sit in my grief, like sit, I had a very hard time being alone, and like just to let myself feel bad and kind of work through it was really, really important.
That's the key. That's one of the keys. And the other key is, once you understand the roadmap, behavior changes leads to new outcomes in your life, right? Like, just understanding yourself doesn't make changes. It's really an action that makes changes, but you can't make actions until you understand what actions need to be taken, and you need to feel your feelings and release and start to heal up what's happened. So it is a process, but it is doable. And you just take one new step and things can change.
Yeah. So, all right. So to recap a little, I hope for everyone, you want to think about where you are kind of on the boundary continuum. Like, recognize, are yours too firm? Do you have no boundaries? Like, where is it hurting you in your life? Where is it hurting your relationships? And then you want to go ahead, Debbie.
Yeah. Where does it come from? What childhood you come from? What were the boundaries like? It's very interrelated with needs being met or not met young. Were you the good one who had to take care of everyone's needs, and you were always trying to make people happy? Did you come from a place where it's hard for you to say no because you're afraid people won't love you or will be angry at you? And again, all of this comes from childhood. You always want to remember, like, what's my motivation? That's back to childhood of like, why am I saying yes? Why am I doing this? Right? Is it, I need to fill my own emptiness. I need to feel special. So I'm going to take care of everyone's needs so I feel okay. Is it
that was mine? Yeah,
that was yours.
Mine,
right? Yeah. And that's a lot of people's, because if our identity is formed by, if we do this, we can fill ourselves up. It's very hard to give it up because then we feel empty.
Right. So we're in everyone's business and
yes,
care, like yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I kind of associate a little bit with the word codependence, the kind of like, you have to just be inside everyone's story all the time in a way.
So that you don't have to feel your own pain and empty. Right. And once you start to feel your own pain and empty, you were then able to tolerate not being in everybody's business. Yeah, 100%.
Angela asked, is this primarily a female issue? That's a great question.
No. It seems like it is, right? Because women, come out with it more, or they're in certain roles in society, but I see this with men all the time. I really do.
That's interesting. Yeah. All right. So you understand really where it's from and where it's tripping you up, and then steps to correct it.
Or, well, what's my motivation? How much will this deplete me?
Yep. Right.
Recognizing what your roadmap is and the areas in which you're feeling depleted. And if you start to recognize how you can't say no, or you're people pleasing, or you feel too empty, and once you start to have those awarenesses, you start to know the sort of more subtle steps that you have to take in your individual life, right? Like I'm giving you the broad strokes, but then you have to do the work of figuring out like what your particular thing is, right? So when we started, Nina said, well, I'm not those things. I was like, not anymore, but you were, and here's where you fit, right? So people always look into how they don't fit into these categories, but like, let's do a little more digging and go into the layers of where you do fit. And then you have to navigate, and it's really about feeling what you need to feel and making some behavioral moves that people in your life might deem as selfish or withstanding.
Right. And then being consistent.
Yes.
Right. And really sticking with it. And remember that line. I really find that so helpful, that idea. Like if you're feeling resentful, look at why.
I love that, actually.
I think that's really, really helpful.
Really helpful.
One of the audience,
I had said it.
Yeah, it's really great. It was her therapist, some random therapist said it.
I'm going to use it.
Yeah, it's so good because it's just it's a good like rule of thumb. Like, am I feeling resentful? Well, then it's not like let me figure it out. Why am I?
What's my part here?
What's my part here? Lizzie in the audience says my mother taught her to say whenever possible, "That sounds terrific, interesting, fun. Can I get back to you?"
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. And she says it really helps her because her reflex used to be yes. That is a great one. Let me think about that for a second. And then someone asks, what happens when your family doesn't respect your boundaries and just laughs at you when you try to set them? An example of that would be the example you gave about not wanting to be around cursing anymore. What if your family just laughed at you when you said that, even though you told them you're serious? They did laugh at me and they cursed at me. An example would be like whatever, I'm having an argument with my 18-year-old daughter about something, and then she would actually we really did have these exact moments. And I remember sitting in this apartment, very calm. I remember a fight we had when we were trying to buy a used car. And I just said, I won't be spoken to that way anymore. And I'm not going to engage in this. I'm not going to get mad at you. 5 years earlier, I would have just gotten really mad and it would have escalated.
So I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Debbie, please.
Yeah. As a theme, whatever you're trying to change, there has to be a consequence to people not listening to you, whether it's, well, then I'm not, walking out of a room, leaving an interaction, hanging up a phone, right? Like you don't have to tolerate people's behaviors. Nina had the capacity to say, well, then get out of my house, right? Not everyone will have that capacity, but you don't want to lose your sense of agency over yourself. We can't make people behave a certain way, but we certainly can change how we behave, right? So I've had people do this, have to set boundaries with mothers and, all sorts of things. And it's like, well, then leave the situation. You don't have to sit there and take it. There's going to be a consequence, and then live through what that feels like.
Right. That's a really good answer, I think. Someone asked for you to reiterate the stroke responsibility message.
Okay. So when you want to communicate anything, oftentimes people do you did this or you did that, and or they will trigger defensiveness in another person, so they automatically will not be heard, right? So I can't guarantee that it will go well because I don't know who's on your other end, but your best line of defense in any communication that you want to have is to start off by saying something that you feel good about in the other person, because it immediately feels good when you hear something good. So, whether I love you or I have so much respect for you or whatever it is, I don't know who you're talking to. And then responsibility is if someone doesn't feel blamed, but they hear that you're taking ownership of whatever you're about to say, that you have 50% stake in it, it also knocks down a defensiveness. So, let's just go to the John example. Like, I love you so much. And I have so much respect for you. And, I know this is partly me. Like, I have 4 of my own kids that deplete me sometimes. I've been with other men that I've had to, deal with their kids. I have a history of this. So you take responsibility, you take ownership, you let them know where you're coming from and what it means about you.
Yeah.
And then you give the message. But I really don't think I can do X, Y, and Z with your children. And I hope you understand.
Yeah, it's really so great. Stroke, responsibility,
message.
And all said calmly and kindly. And
and that's, it's your best line of defense of getting a good reaction back.
Yeah, because part of that idea is also, I think, remembering, women have so much shame often, like we feel like we're being bad or we feel guilty. And so, and if you deliver something, I think this is something I learned from Brene Brown, actually, in one book of hers, this idea that, like, if you're really vulnerable in your presentation, if you're honest and clear and kind, it's hard for people to get angry at you, basically. Like, it's one thing if you're screaming and yelling and you're saying mean things and you're not making sense, but if you're, grounded and clear, like, you're just saying your truth, like, you're doing the best you can. We're all doing the best we can.
Yes. Problem is, people are afraid to be vulnerable. They're afraid to be authentic. People are very bad communicators. They just get triggered. They get resentful. They get wounded. They withdraw. They blame. That's the way of human interaction. So learning the appropriate way, it can make all the difference in the world.
Yeah. So that's the answer. Another question about this method, stroke, responsibility, message, thinking about how you're delivering it. And again, the whole idea of boundaries is like kind of owning your truth and then figuring out how to, meet the other person, basically.
And again, starting from the beginning, where do I end and where do you begin? Where's my space? Where's your space? Right. So not letting people into your space that feels uncomfortable and not going into their space that makes them uncomfortable. Right.
Recognizing what's appropriate is a very simple way of looking at it also. Right.
And oftentimes when we're the people pleasers, like for you, Nina, I'm just using you as an example, put yourself out there, getting into everyone's business and taking care of it. Like, that was crossing their boundaries. They didn't want you in their business. They didn't want you running their lives, Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you didn't know where you ended and they began. It was all one big glommed thing.
Yep. So completely true. And I feel so much better now. This is our last question. This has been so great, Debbie. How about sibling dynamics, i.e. 4 of us are caring for our elderly mom. We each have different areas, strengths, e.g. her health, her apartment, caregivers. One brother likes to assign duties and tally sweat equity. How do I say no when he then tries to guilt trip and says I'm slacking? My answer to that is you have to figure out what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do and just be clear about it and then let go of his throwing stuff on you. But let's hear from Debbie.
Well, yeah, that's the concreteness. And this is where it goes to, this is all emotional. And, your inability to say no to your brother. Obviously it's going to be rooted young, you're afraid to anger him or afraid to, have him be mad at you or not love you. It's coming from something in there that you have a fear. And it is going to figure out what is too much, do it, and deal with the feelings afterwards. People want to avoid how bad it feels after, the guilt or the pain or the fear or whatever it is. The only way to actually make a change is go through that middle part of discomfort in your own life. And that's an overall thing for change where I'll leave everybody with, like, it's really hard to change. That's why so many people leave therapy early. They learn about themselves and then they're out and their lives stay the same. And that's what I was saying earlier to you, Nina. Like, if you don't make a behavioral shift with all the knowledge that you gain, you're smart with the same life. It's taking the risk of your own discomfort that leads to newness. So she's got to take a risk for her and go through her own discomfort and say no to her brother.
So that's interesting. She says, I do say no, and he's always angry and dismissive toward me. So
exactly. And so she has to be able to tolerate that and not be, it's almost like, what's the word I'm looking for? It's emotional, like blackmail. Like, if you don't do what I want, I'm not going to talk to you. And, you know, that's a really unpleasant feeling for us to tolerate, for someone to withdraw, not deal with us. But
right.
you want to have agency over yourself. You can't give into the emotional warfare. You have to say, you know, communicate. And
you have to take care. This is a case, to Barb and Jen, who agrees with her, where you have to take care of yourself. And I think the growth, the kind of emotional growth, is when it doesn't bother you anymore, that he's like, you have to separate yourself from it a little bit.
Correct. And that's a process. And you can also communicate, I don't like how this feels, but I'm unwilling to tolerate this behavior. I'm here when you want to treat me better, you know?
Right. Kind of what I did.
But to get from A to C here, that middle part, that's a process. That's not an overnight gig.
Right. It's uncomfortable. So keep doing what you're doing, Barb, because you're going to get there.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been fantastic. Debbie, I love you. You're so great. Again, Dr. Debbie Magids, you can find her on Instagram. She's a therapist in New York. She's fabulous. Tell your friends about Revel. Revel is still free to join now for the first 20,000 members. And it's a fabulous community, and we're so grateful to everyone who's here.